Okay, good afternoon all. And I'm going to pause for a few seconds here before we get started just to confirm that all the attendees are able to connect and that nobody will miss the beginning portion of the presentation. Thank you all for being patient. Okay, why don't we get started? Welcome. My name is Jeff Freeman and I work for Engineering Enterprises Incorporated. And welcome to today's virtual stakeholder meeting for the City of Joliet's Alternative Water Source Program. We're excited that everybody took the time out of their busy schedule to learn about the current status. Today, along with myself, we have 3 other panelists that will be doing the majority of the discussion. Given all of the technical background, I'm here to moderate on behalf of this fine panelists. I will have a couple slides here at the beginning and then at the end, and then in between, we'll have Allison Swisher from the City of Joliet. She is the Director of Public Utilities from the city and the city staff lead on this overall project. We have 2 project managers for the consulting team, one of which is Joe Johnson. And Joe works with Stantec and again is one of the project managers. And then the other panelist will be Teresa O'Grady from Crawford Murphy and Tilley, who again is a project manager for the consulting team. This is intended to be an open discussion or a collaborative discussion overall. We do invite folks to list out questions. We do ask that rather than using the chat panel, that you use the Q&A panel so you can see, in your Zoom control bar that the furthest right portion of that control bar will be a Q&A panel. We request that if you have a question to open that up and then go ahead and submit your questions. Myself as the moderator will inventory those questions as they come along. And at the end of our technical presentation, I'll present those to our panelists to have them respond to them. We are generally hoping this will be an hour and a half and have set up enough time in the overall schedule to take questions and provide as many answers as we can. We hope to be able to get to everybody's, but please let's just get into that situation where we have actually too many questions, just because that will indicate that it's the good interactive program that we're hoping it to be. Looking at the agenda, and just to give you an idea of how this flows together, we have myself doing the introductions, and then right after that, we're going to go into Allison. And before I go on, I did notice that in the chat, there is one person that indicated that there's an echo. And I also saw somebody, Allison, respond that she's not getting the same thing. So if some folks are hearing an echo, please let me know via the chat or in the question and answer panel, and then we'll try to get that corrected. Okay, so back to the agenda. Again, opening remarks by me, almost done with those, and then Allison's going to take us through where things are at with the Alternative Water Source Program. Next, Joe is going to talk about the intake into Lake Michigan, the considerations there, along with the water treatment basics. Teresa is going to lead us through the transmission main routing 101, and then she'll roll right into looking at the water source transfer plan. And at that point, again, we hope to leave around 25 minutes for the Q&A towards the end. So please submit those questions as we go so that we can have that time at the end to answer them. So with that, Allison is now up to bat to take us through her portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you to everyone for participating today in our virtual stakeholder meeting. We're very excited. We have over 65 people registered. So we're really glad that we're able to provide the information today to so many people. And in spite of our ability not to have this in person, I think we have a lot of good information that we want to share with everyone. So I know some of you have been following this issue for a long time, but I know there's also some new folks on the line that are probably attending their first meeting about the Alternative Water Source Program. So in the beginning, I'm going to provide some background information on the work that's been completed to date. And then I'm going to discuss the work that's going to be performed in 2020 that will get us to the council decision on the alternative water source later this year. So it's always important that when we start these meetings that we understand why we're doing this. And as this graph shows, the city's existing water source, which is the deep aquifer, is not sustainable. And we know this from the groundwater modeling that has been done by the Illinois State Water Survey. They found that in the fall of 2018 that we would not be able to meet maximum day demands by 2030. This was further confirmed with updated modeling that was completed this past spring. One of the questions that I probably receive most frequently is, with it raining so much this past year, why do we still need to do this? Isn't the aquifer recharging? And I think it's important to understand that our aquifer does not recharge in that manner through, the rain water percolating through. So it's the water that's there is unsustainable, and it's very important that we find this new water source and have it online by 2030. I'll also mention that this is not a Joliet only issue. It's a regional issue. There's a number of other communities in the Will County and Kendall County area that also obtain their drinking water from this aquifer, as well as industries in the area. So just briefly go over the history of the study that we have completed. The study was completed in 2 phases. The first phase, the goal was to evaluate all potential alternatives, and that was 14 different water source alternatives that we investigated that included river sources, aquifer recharge, and looking at other aquifers. And really the goal of phase 1 was to evaluate those alternatives for both water quality and water quantity. I've been in the past month getting a lot of questions about the Des Plaines River and why we're not considering that option. And I'll refer people back to the phase 1 study. At that time, we did consider that river source alternative, and for quality reasons, that was not moved forward then for further evaluation. In phase 2, we did further evaluate 5 water source alternatives. We did a much deeper dive into the Illinois River, the Kankakee River, and then 3 Lake Michigan alternatives. I will state that we evaluated those alternatives for both a 30 MGD and a 60 MGD scenario. And the difference there is that the 30 MGD would be the water to Joliet, and the 60 MGD would be a regional solution. So as I mentioned previously from the very beginning, the city has always considered evaluating these alternatives for not only Joliet, but also as a regional water supply. So then this information was presented to the City Council in the fall of 2019. In January of this year, they selected Lake Michigan water as the alternative water source for the city, and then directed city staff to simultaneously investigate 2 of those variations on Lake Michigan water. One is a new Indiana intake, and the other is purchasing water from the Chicago Department of Water Management. And I'll go into more detail to describe what those 2 alternatives are. It's important to note that the City Council selection of Lake Michigan provides a lot of benefits to residents and the region in general. It is a very sustainable supply of water and can provide water to not only Joliet, but the region as well. And it's also a very high quality water. Currently residents in Joliet, you might have a water softener to address the hardness of our current water. And when we switch to Lake Michigan water, that will no longer be necessary, also residents who may be purchasing bottled water or having home water delivery. We do see that when we switch to Lake Michigan water, we will have that high quality water that many of the residents identified as being reasons why they supported Lake Michigan Water. So the first alternative that we're evaluating further during 2020 is the new Indiana intake alternative. And very briefly, this alternative consists of constructing a new intake on the southwestern side of Lake Michigan, in somewhere in northwest Indiana. There would then be a 47 miles of transmission main, and that would transmit raw water from the lake and transmit that to a water treatment plant that would be located on the east side of Joliet. From there, then the water would be pumped and distributed throughout the system. The construction costs for this project range from $900 million to $1.1 billion, and that depends upon the whether this is a Joliet only project or a regional project. The monthly typical water bill increase ranges from about $67 to $56, and then the total 50-year cost of the project ranges from $3.9 billion to $5.4 billion. I will point out that for those water bill increases, that is for a typical Joliet customer, and that would be in addition to about the $30 that residents currently pay per month for water. So for this alternative, some of the major differentiators would be that this option allows the city to have control over water rates and implementation. However, we recognize that there is a greater implementation risk due to the project complexity. However, when you look at the 50-year total cost in comparison to the purchased water from Chicago option, it is lower. So the next alternative that we're still evaluating in 2020 is purchasing water from the Chicago Department of Water Management. And this alternative consists of connecting to the city's existing water supply at the Southwest Pumping Station, which is at approximately 84th and Kedvale in Chicago, constructing approximately 30 miles of transmission main, and then having the finished water enter Joliet system at the Fairmont and Garvin receiving station on the east side of Joliet. The capital costs for this program range from $550 million to $650 million, and the typical bill increase ranges from about $60 to $52. However, as I mentioned previously, the 50-year total cost is greater than that option for the Indiana intake. So for this option, major considerations are that this is an existing water supplier, so there's less risk. However, there is that greater 50-year total cost. As I mentioned previously, we are looking at the water alternatives as being a regional water system. We've been meeting with potential regional partners this summer to gauge the interest in participating in a regional water system. As I'd shown on the slides previously, there is advantages to working together, such as reducing the rates for everyone. And so this exhibit here just shows the communities that we've been talking to, and we will continue to have those discussions and work towards a regional water system. This is a big picture overview schedule. As I mentioned, in 2020, we're doing the alternatives evaluation, and the final selection would be in December of 2020. We'd then move into preliminary design, and then final design would occur in 2022 to 2024. Construction wouldn't begin until 2025 and would be for approximately a 5-year period, with the completion being in 2030 to allow for the new water source to be online. So there's a lot of work that is going to be done in those next 10 years, but at the end of the day, the goal is that the new water source will be available to residents in 2030. This is a much more detailed schedule showing the work that we're doing. I'm not going to read through all this, but if you're interested in more information about exactly what we're doing in the alternatives evaluation or the preliminary design, final design phases, then you can go to the city website, and this schedule is available there. I do want to spend time, though, talking in more detail about the work that's proposed in 2020. There is a lot of work to be done, and it's all very, very important work that we're doing. So I'm going to walk through very briefly a month-to-month schedule so that you can see the work that we have completed and also the work that is going to be upcoming. So in April of this past year, we retained a team of experts who are going to do the engineering and planning associated with the program. The two project managers for this program, Joe Johnson and Teresa Grady, are on the phone today. And we're very confident that this team will get us to where we need to be with the new water supply. In May, we started meeting with regulatory agencies. That includes IEPA, IDNR, and many other regulatory agencies that are going to play a major role in the program. We also did start talking with water supply, such as the City of Chicago, and water access providers, such as the City of Hammond, to evaluate those and begin discussions regarding those agreements that will need to be in place to provide water. We also started or kicked off our regional planning and hosted a meeting with the 16 potential regional partners that I had mentioned previously. We also had our first stakeholder meeting, and those meetings are being held every other month. So please, look for those. The next one's going to be in September. We also issued our first monthly newsletter, and we are issuing those every month. If you sign up for our stakeholder list, you'll get those delivered directly into your inbox. In June, I want to highlight that we did host our first City Council workshop. This was our opportunity to update the Joliet City Council. And really that focus of that meeting was discussing risk and also discussing the documents that we're going to be preparing throughout 2020 that will be presented to them this fall. And those documents is the prospectus, and that's really a side-by-side comparison of the two alternatives that are further being evaluated in 2020. And now we're in July, and really the focus of July is we've really been focusing on some more technical discussions, such as the transmission main routing. Teresa will talk about that in more detail. And then also really doing an evaluation of regional governance structures. And that governance structure is going to be presented to our City Council at a workshop in August, which is going to be held on August 25th. So we encourage everyone today, that meeting will be live streamed and also televised on Channel 6. So we encourage everyone today to put that on your calendar to participate on August 25th from 5 to 7 in our second City Council workshop. And that meeting will be presenting the results of the Phase 1 transmission main routing study, discussing the regional governance structure that staff is proposing, and then also talking about water treatment in more detail. Also in August, we have the Finance Committee meeting, and in that meeting, we're really going to be discussing affordability. I know a lot of people have questions about how are they going to be able to afford to pay for their water bill, given the significant rate increases that are proposed. So that's something that we're looking at in a lot of detail, is identifying, what is affordable and what maybe some mitigating efforts can be taken to make sure that it's affordable for all of our residents. Another key milestone in August will be submitting our Lake Michigan allocation application. That's something we've been working on all summer. That will be ready to submit in August. We currently have been having many discussions with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, who oversees the allocation process. And given our discussions with them, we understand that Joliet qualifies for that allocation. In September, we'll be having our third stakeholder meeting. We do plan that will be held virtually again. And then also move forward with more technical work on a level 2 transmission main routing study. Really in October is when we start compiling all the information that we've been collecting and evaluating during the year. We're going to prepare and submit the draft funding strategy. Currently, our funding strategy is a mix of federal and state low interest loans plus revenue bonds. We're very excited that the city has been selected to submit an application for WIFIA, which is a federal low interest loan program that would fund up to 49% of the project costs. That funding strategy was presented at a finance committee meeting that is a public meeting. And then in November, we will be having our third City Council workshop, at which time we will present the prospectus documents, which, as I mentioned before, are the side-by-side comparison of the Indiana alternative versus the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative. In December, we are planning to host a public forum that will likely be the first week of December. At that public forum, we would encourage everyone to attend and be able to provide your comments to the City Council so they can include that information in their decision-making process. And then at the end of the year, we'll be seeking a decision from our City Council on the water source alternative. That will allow us then to move into January with beginning preliminary design. Encourage everyone to get involved. It's very important that we have feedback from our stakeholders. As I mentioned before, you can sign up for our mailing list on the project website at rethinkwaterjoliet.org. If you do that, you will get our monthly newsletter delivered to your inbox. In that newsletter, we do have monthly educational topics that really do provide a lot more information about the major components of the work that we're doing. Also encourage you to attend the public meetings, these virtual stakeholder meetings, as well as the City Council workshops, and really ask that you help spread the word. Please talk to your neighbors about this. Joliet's a large community and a lot of people have a lot going on, but water is a very important topic, and we don't want anyone to be surprised when 2030 comes that we're switching water sources. So again, I thank you all for attending today. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Joe Johnson, who is going to talk about water treatment plant basics.
Thanks, Allison. I appreciate everyone's time this afternoon. One of the things that we wanted to do today was talk a little bit about some of the things that differentiate the two alternatives and make sure that folks understand some of the key differences. As you all are aware, Joliet currently uses groundwater as its source of supply, drawing water from a number of wells and treating that at several distributed treatment facilities throughout the city. With both the options that are being considered for the alternative source, we'll be switching to a surface water source to Lake Michigan. One of the options, the Chicago option, will involve the purchase of treated water from the city of Chicago. In that case, Joliet will no longer have to treat the raw water. They will monitor the water quality and make sure that the quality of water being delivered to residents is being maintained, but the city will not have to operate its own surface water treatment plant. But the other alternative, the new Indiana intake alternative, will require a new intake into the lake, as well as a new surface water treatment plant. And that's a different entity or a different facility from what Joliet has historically operated. So we want to talk a little bit about those two items. So the role of intake in a water treatment plant and water system is pretty straightforward, but they're key to providing the system with high quality and reliable source of water. In this case, the intake on Lake Michigan is the structure and the pipeline that allows the city to draw water out of the lake, bring it to a surface pumping station, a shore pumping station, where it's then conveyed to the water treatment plant. The water treatment plant is where the processes are implemented that make sure that the water, the finished or treated water, is high quality, that meets all the standards and meets the objectives of the residents of Joliet. That treated water is then supplied to the distribution system and to the customers. In our phase 2 analysis, there were schematics developed of the different alternatives that Joliet is considering. And this is one of the schematics for the new Indiana intake alternative. I'm not going to walk through all the details, but the key point here is the items circled are the two elements that we're talking about. So the large circle at the right of the slide highlights the intake facility. So these are really the first parts of the infrastructure system that bring the water into the system of pipes and pumps to bring it to Joliet. And then the current concept is that raw water would be pumped toward Joliet to a treatment plant site closer to the city, where that raw water would be treated and disinfected and made suitable for distribution to the community. When we talk about an intake in Lake Michigan, this graphic shows a general concept of what an intake might look like, or typically looks like in this area. There are a number of communities along the southern and western and eastern shore of Lake Michigan that operate these types of intakes. Typically, it involves a pipeline structure that's buried in the bottom of the lake that extends out some distance to an inlet structure. And there are a couple of different types of inlet structures, but that inlet structure typically extends up off the bottom of the lake. That's where the water is drawn in, conveyed through the pipe to a shore pumping system where it's screened and then pumped on towards the water treatment plant. Typically, in designing an intake of this nature, there would be a series of soil borings performed. So these blue vertical lines give an indication of generally kind of a spacing of soil programs that would be conducted to understand what the lake bottom is and provide that information to the construction contractor. It's also important in designing the intake to look at the variation in lake levels. I think a lot of people in this area are aware the lake is currently very high, but within the last 10 years, we were also in a period where it was at a very low lake level. And so it's important to make sure that that intake system is designed to be robust and reliable and provide the capacity needed to supply the water that Joliet would need over a range of conditions. As I mentioned, the intake typically has multiple components. There's the pipe, and so the picture on the left side shows an example of a pipe being lowered into the lake as part of an intake construction project. That pipe would be buried in a trench on the bottom of the lake. And at the inlet structure at the lake end of the system, there are a variety of different configurations. In a lot of places in Lake Michigan, there's an inlet or a pipe that extends up from the pipe buried in the lake bed that's surrounded by a timber crib or a wooden crib that protects it and provides for a smooth distribution of flow into that pipeline. Another option is some intakes have a set of intake cones, as shown in the third picture, that extend up from the lake bottom and through which the water is drawn into the system. There are a lot of factors that go into the siting of an intake. Obviously, critical is water quality, as we want to try to put the intake in a location where we have reliable water quality. We want to understand, are there pollution sources or hazards in the area? How do we protect the intake from those? There has to be land available for the shore facilities that we're going to construct for a pumping station. Water depth is very important. During the winter, as you can imagine, the water in Lake Michigan gets very cold. And under certain circumstances, you can form what's called frazzle ice below the surface of the water. And that ice can begin to clog up an intake. So making sure we have adequate depth to protect the intake and allow us to mitigate the risk of ice formation is important. Geotechnical conditions, what's the lake bottom like? That's why we do the soil borings, to understand that. Being aware of shipping and navigational lanes. There's a lot of shipping activity in the southwestern part of Lake Michigan. We want to make sure that our intake is deep enough and located in an area where it's not vulnerable to a large freighter dragging an anchor or something else that could impact the intake. And then lastly, the general coastal environment and shipwrecks. There are shipwrecks and items like that across the southwestern part of the lake. And there are sediment and current transport patterns that occur in the lake. It's important for us to understand those. So all of these factors are currently being considered in our efforts to figure out where might be a good location for a new intake for Joliet. This next slide is a navigation chart from the southwestern part of Lake Michigan. The items shown in red are existing water supply intakes that extend out from shore that supply water plants in Chicago, Hammond, East Chicago, and for an Indiana American facility that supplies Gary and other communities in Indiana. And again, these intakes range from several thousand feet out into the lake at various depths, various types of material. But we've been looking carefully at what we can learn from the existing intake structures, as well as from the conditions around the lake, to figure out where are locations in this area that would be suitable for a new intake for Joliet. So that talks a little bit about the intake structure and how we bring water into the system. Then the other key component is, what do we do to treat that water to make sure that we're delivering to the residents and businesses in Joliet the high quality water that they're expecting. As Allison mentioned, we start with a very high quality source in Lake Michigan, but still there's treatment that's required to make sure that that water is suitable for consumption by residents. Key objectives that have been established for our team are certainly to make sure that the treatment facility would be capable of meeting all federal and state treatment requirements, and there are a lot of those. We'll talk about those in a minute. It is important that the process is able to manage taste and odor. While Lake Michigan is a very large lake, there can be variations in the taste of the water over seasonal periods. And we've learned a great deal over the years about what's required to manage that and make sure that we provide residents with a water that's not only safe, but also tastes good and is, attractive to people who are consuming it. And then lastly, and this is a difference between the two alternatives, in building its own treatment facility, Joliet has the opportunity to look at its own water quality objectives. Treatment plants, and we'll talk about the options there for the types of processes, can be designed to meet a wide range of conditions, not just meet the minimum standards, but also go beyond those. If Joliet is designing and constructing and operating its own treatment facility, it has control over that process and can make some decisions about what's the appropriate level of treatment that the city wants to provide. The city of Chicago has historically provided very high quality water to a large number of communities in the region, but under the purchased water alternative with Chicago, Joliet would not have much say in that treatment process. So that is a difference between the two options. I mentioned previously that there are a lot of regulations that govern the treatment of drinking water, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but just suffice it to say there are federal regulations, state regulations, specific regulations tied to the Safe Drinking Water Act. One of these is called the Surface Water Treatment Rule, the Enhanced Surface Water Treatment Rule, which makes sure that risks related to microbial contamination are managed in the treatment process. And then there's a whole nother series of regulations that relate to the quality of the water as it moves through the transmission and distribution system. So there's a rule that relates to what we call disinfection byproducts, to make sure that in the process of disinfecting the water, we're not creating other contaminants that could pose a risk to health. There's a lead and copper rule to make sure that the water is stable and that it's not going to pose a corrosion hazard that could lead to lead issues or copper issues in the delivered water. And then there are other rules related to filter backwash. And lastly, what's called the unregulated contaminants monitoring rule, which looks out into the future and says there are things that we aren't currently, that the federal government, the state government are not currently regulating, that we may need to consider. There's ongoing research into those. So our process of our efforts to evaluate treatment processes right now are looking at all of those regulations, both current and potential future regulations. In addition to those items, there are contaminants of emerging concern that people may have heard about. Sampling in Lake Michigan, as well as other sources of water around the country, have identified pharmaceuticals, personal care products, metals such as hexavalent chromium, compounds like PFAS, which is related to a variety of different industrial processes, but commonly associated, for example, with non-stick surfaces. It's a byproduct of that process. And microplastics. And if you Google water quality in Lake Michigan, you'll find issues that have been raised about these types of parameters. Our team is looking very carefully at the range of treatment options that are available to Joliet. And as I said, we're looking into the future and saying, how do we make sure that the process we're considering and incorporating into our alternative has the capability to deal with these issues that may emerge in the future, and make sure that we have a reliable and robust system for delivering high quality water to the city. A key part of that effort that's been ongoing over this summer and late spring has been a review of available water quality data. So this map shows the location of a variety of sampling sites out in Lake Michigan. Some of these have multiple samples that have been taken over long periods of time. Others reflect sites that have only been sampled a few times. But we were able to research a significant amount of this information and collect more than 20,000 data points about existing water quality in the lake to understand what the conditions are that a treatment plant in Joliet may have to deal with. In addition, we've been reviewing the records from many of the existing water treatment facilities along the southwestern and western shore of the lake to understand how they deal with the challenges that they face on a regular basis. When we talk about treatment processes, there is what we call a conventional surface water treatment process that's been refined over the years, but is really in general structure similar to what's been done for the last 100 years since communities have started implementing rigorous treatment processes. This schematic kind of shows how that works. Typically, There are some chemicals added to the raw water as it comes into the treatment facility. The water goes through a process of flocculation, where those chemicals are mixed with the water, and the water is stirred to try to get sediment and particles in the water to agglomerate or combine with each other to form larger size particles that then can settle out in a sedimentation process or be filtered out before the water is then disinfected to make sure that any bacteria is killed before the water is put out into the clear well for pumping out into the distribution system. So while it looks like a fairly simple process, there's a tremendous amount of technology and research that's gone into how to optimize these various processes and make sure that we're providing very high quality water. This is typical of the process used by many Lake Michigan systems. So Chicago uses a conventional process system. Hammond, Indiana uses a similar system. Evanston, Illinois, and many of the other providers on the west shore of Lake Michigan use this type of conventional treatment process. However, as you can imagine with most things, technology has led to new advances, and there are advanced treatment processes that are finding their way into the process of water treatment and being used in a variety of applications. So for example, the cities of Highland Park and East Chicago have built new water treatment facilities in the last 10 years that use membrane filtration, where rather than a gravity filter system, their water is actually pushed through at relatively high pressure through a system of membranes that have the ability to remove a wide range of contaminants and produce a very high quality water at the discharge side of the facility. The process requires more energy than a conventional treatment process and requires membranes that be changed out on a fairly regular period of time, but it is highly effective and again is being used at certain treatment plants. Other processes in the area or other utilities have incorporated more advanced processes into their conventional systems. So they may have included a step that involves the use of ozone, ozonation, which is a highly effective oxidation process that can be used to break down certain contaminants and also address taste and odor issues. UV light is used for disinfection at some facilities. And so instead of adding chlorine as a disinfectant, UV light can be used to disinfect the water and inactivate bacteria or viruses that may be contained in the water. Our team of process experts is looking at all these different options for Joliet, and as part of the presentation to the council in late August, we'll be sharing with them recommendations regarding a range of alternative processes and what we believe is an appropriate process for Joliet. So we've talked about the intake, we've talked about the treatment process. We're going through intake siting studies. Those will lead eventually to a conceptual design for the intake that will serve as the basis for updated estimates of costs for construction and operation. We're also going through the process evaluation I talked about, which is leading up to a conceptual design of a water treatment plant that will similarly be used to generate capital and operating costs. The output of those efforts will roll into a basis of design report that will describe those improvements, present conceptual layouts, and include the cost estimates I talked about. And those outputs will then go into the prospectus documents that Allison has talked about that will be presented to the City Council in November of this year to help them make their decision. So all of this work is going to make sure we understand the details of what's involved in developing a new surface water source for Joliet and getting that water to the city. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Teresa O'Grady, and she's going to talk a little bit about the next part of the system, which is the transmission main and how we get water from the new source to Joliet. So Teresa, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Joe. As Joe said, my name is Teresa O'Grady. I'm from Crawford, Murphy, and Tilly. Along with Joe, I'm one of the project managers for the consulting team working on the alternative water source program. And so I'm going to talk to you about two things today. First, we're going to start out with the transmission main routing 101. And I'm going to give an overview of what a transmission main is, why we do transmission main routing, and what considerations need to be factored into a routing study, such as the transmission main routings for Joliet's alternative water source program. So let's jump right in. So first of all, transmission mains are pipes that transmit water from one point to the other. They're typically larger diameter, at least 16-inch or greater. They extend for long distances. They are typically not looped. They do not have water services, and they have minimal connections. They also have less fittings, so that how that makes a difference is there's less energy lost in the pipe from the starting point to the ending point. So in the two alternatives that Allison described earlier, we have quite a bit of transmission main going from the source to Joliet. And for the Chicago Department of Water Management alternative, it's about 30 miles of transmission main. And for the new Indiana intake alternative, it's about 47 miles. And these pipe diameters range from 48-inch to 66-inch, depending on the capacity of the alternative that we're looking at, whether it's the 30 MGD with Joliet only, or the 60 MGD regional alternative. So then when we're looking at distribution mains are the network of pipes that distributes water from the source within the city to the customer. So they're typically smaller diameter mains, 16-inch diameter or less. They are looped. They are interconnected at crossings and such as intersections. They have water service connections and typically have more fittings, and that results in a little bit more energy loss through the system. So as you see there on the right, that's an exhibit of the city's distribution system showing the network of distribution mains in the system. So now that we've defined what that transmission main is, we can talk more specifically about the routing of transmission mains for the alternative water source program. Both alternatives have a significant length of transmission main required, as I said, between 30 miles and 47 miles, with the majority being constructed outside city limits. And that's important because the city will have less control for stuff constructed without outside city limits. So the best analogy that I can describe when talking about routing of transmission mains is driving. In both cases, when you're driving or with the routing of transmission mains, you have a starting point and an ending point. And in both cases, you cannot go in a straight line. For driving, you need to follow existing roads. And for transmission main routing, you need to follow either existing right-of-ways or utility corridors or other corridors that might exist. For driving, you can probably find a shorter distance, but it might take as long or longer depending on the number of traffic lights and the speed limit you can drive on that route. For transmission main routing, it's similar. A shorter route might be more congested, resulting in a higher cost to construct. So again, continuing with this analogy, with driving, you're trying to optimize time. You're trying to find a route that takes the shortest time to get from your starting point to your destination. With transmission main routing, you're really trying to optimize cost and to some extent complexity. Finding a route that's the most cost effective, both short term and long term, is the goal. So in keeping this in mind, there are several considerations to finding the most cost effective transmission main route. In the phase 2 study, a conceptual route was developed for each alternative, generally looking at ownership and favoring utility corridors. So the overall length of the transmission main route and construction corridor types, whether it's low density, medium density, or high density, was considered. So this information was used to prepare construction cost estimates in the phase 2 study. In 2020, we're taking a deeper dive into the transmission main routing. So we're collecting information such as land ownership, major utilities, environmental, right-of-way lines, railroads, waterways, etc. And using that data to build a GIS database. So the first step in the evaluation is the level 1 corridor study, which evaluates several routes using the level 1 considerations, which I'll talk about in just a minute, in order to perform a quantitative analysis to determine the easiest, most cost-effective route. And this route will be presented to the City Council, as Allison mentioned, at the August 25th City Council workshop. So after that, the next step in the evaluation is the level 2 routing study, which will use the recommended route from the level 1 study and fine-tune the alignment based on level 2 considerations, which again, I'll talk about that next. So the level 2 study recommendations will then be used to compile an updated cost estimate and incorporate those into the basis of design report and the prospectus documents, which will be presented to the City Council to assist in their decision making of the alternative water source at the end of the year. So there are several considerations for the evaluation of possible transmission main routes in the level 1 study. So that's the first study we're working on right now. So length of transmission main, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Typically what you end up having is your length will relate to your cost of the main. So typically a shorter distance will be less costly, but we have to factor in these other considerations as well. Another consideration is land ownership. Who owns the land? Is it owned by ComEd, IDOT, the Tollway, Forest Preserve, other municipalities, or possibly a private landowner? Also, what is the access for construction and future maintenance? What type of agreement would be required and have to be executed to use the land for the water main, for the transmission main routing? And what will the cost of that be? Also, what is the process for obtaining permission to use that land? And how complicated is it? Will it take a long time to obtain? Another consideration is the number of agencies, parcels, and entities. As you can imagine, if you're looking at 30 miles to 47 miles, there's a lot of land to cover and potentially a lot of agencies and landowners to coordinate with. Also, major crossings or obstacles, which would likely require some kind of trenchless construction, which typically costs more than open trench construction. Also, the corridor type. Construction cost will increase as you get into a higher density area, not only because of complexity of that route, but also restoration that would be required. So also we consider the overall cost, including any land acquisition or access or use fees. And then the final consideration in the level 1 study is major constructability risks. If there's anything with one route or another that's extenuating that will make that route more complex. So in the level 2 routing study, which would be done after the August City Council workshop, we also consider a few more items in that level 2 study. We take into account the level 1 corridor study routing considerations that we just talked about, but also we're looking at major utilities, whether we're going parallel to them or crossing them, and whether there's enough space in the right-of-way or corridor with any kind of major utilities, either parallel or crossing, or does the route need to change to avoid a conflict? Also looking at environmental considerations, wetlands, floodplains, endangered species. While we can use trenchless construction under some of these, it sometimes is better to avoid environmental areas and change the route. So we'll be looking at that as well. For soil conditions, constructability becomes an issue in areas with poor soil conditions, as well as specialized excavation and disposal requirements in areas with contaminated soils. Bedrock depth. There are locations where the bedrock is closer to the surface and could result in higher construction costs and making excavation not only costly, but time consuming and difficult. Traffic count comes into play as well. Roadways with a higher traffic count will be more difficult for construction, resulting in higher construction costs and greater impact to the traveling public. And then finally, level 2 consideration of railroad crossings. As with any major crossing, permitting and specialized requirements come into play. And so we need to make sure that's considered in the route to determine whether that route makes sense or a modification of that route. So these level 1 and level 2 considerations give you a glimpse into the considerations for transmission main routing. While a certain route might look easy, there's a lot of investigation and analysis to determine whether it's the best route. So why do we do routing studies? Especially at this stage of the program, we're performing routing studies in order to refine and optimize transmission main routes based on these construction conditions. Once we have a more optimized route, we can update cost estimates. These cost estimates then can be incorporated into the basis of design report and prospectus for each alternative, allowing the city to have more information for the selection of the alternative water source at the end of the year. And then once that alternative water source is selected, these routes can then be the starting point for the 2021 routing study during preliminary design, in which case there'll be additional considerations for the 2021 routing study, such as looking at all utilities, looking at congestion in the right-of-way or corridor, survey data, doing outreach to municipalities along the route, looking at public impacts such as residential and commercial, and looking at land acquisition, with the goal of having a preliminary alignment of the transmission main for the selected alternative by the end of 2021, so that then that can be moved into final design in 2022. So while we've covered a lot of ground in the past few minutes, hopefully you have a better understanding of the transmission main routing and really all the effort that goes into determining the most feasible, cost-effective route. So next I'll be speaking about how to plan for water source transfer. I'm going to discuss water quality concerns associated with switching water sources and how we're mitigating those risks through the alternative water source program. Okay, this topic of switching water sources and potential impact to water quality has been a concern and has been brought to the forefront by issues that occurred in Flint recently. Different water sources have different raw water quality and different water quality treatment, which can result in different water chemistry. Similar water sources with similar treatment can have similar water chemistry. So as we're looking at switching water sources, the water chemistry is key here. For communities with lead services, such as Joliet, there's a concern with the corrosivity of the water. And so water that's more corrosive has the potential for lead to leak into from the lead service into the home. And if the water is less corrosive, it can be scale forming, which can reduce the carrying capacity of pipes in the system. So understanding the water chemistry between the different water sources is key to making sure that customers are not impacted by this switch. So looking at the existing water source, Joliet's existing water source includes 21 deep wells and 5 shallow wells, which are then treated for radium removal at 11 HMO hydrous manganese oxide water treatment plants. And so, as Allison mentioned, Joliet will be switching to a new water source by 2030. And the new water source will be Lake Michigan water. So the treatment will depend on the alternative selected. Joe talked about this. Could be conventional surface water treatment, which is being done through Chicago Department of Water Management alternative, or possibly more advanced treatment, as Joe mentioned, if it's the new Indiana intake alternative. What we know for sure is that the new source water quality will be different than the existing source water quality. And so that is a concern. We understand that switching water sources can be a major risk that needs to be mitigated. So we even now are doing early investigations to verify that no impact will occur when switching water sources. And switching water sources, I know we interchange this a little bit, is also called water source transfer. And so when we talk about the water source transfer plan, it's the plan for switching water sources. So given the complexity of this issue, we've engaged a national corrosion control expert, David Cornwell from Cornwell Engineering Group, to advise the city and the project team through this alternative water source program. So that planning has already begun and is being coordinated with IEPA, even though the transfer won't occur for another 10 years. So as we look at the water source transfer planning efforts over the next 10 years, there's several things that we're doing up front, even prior to design and construction of the improvements. So this slide gives an overview of those activities, and we'll go into more detail in the next few slides. So first we have the evaluation in 2020 that we're doing now, then followed by pipe loop testing in 2021 to 2022. After that is final design and construction of the improvements, with then in 2030 will be the water source switch, and then after that will be monitoring of the water quality in the distribution system. So first of all, in the 2020 evaluation, there's two parts to this evaluation. First of all is analyzing the water quality of the existing source, part one, and then analyzing the impact of water quality of the new source to the existing system. So there's several tasks in this part one, and this is some of the stuff that we're doing right now. So collecting water quality data from the existing water source, analyzing that, and conducting desktop water quality evaluations. Our consultant, Cornwell Engineering, is also looking at the proposed revised lead and copper rule to determine how it's going to impact Joliet. City staff is currently harvesting lead pipes and collecting water and sending those to Cornwell Engineering Group in order to perform scale classification and lead solubility studies. So the next part of this is the analysis of the impact of the water quality of the new source. And so once the part one is complete, our sub-consultant, Cornwell Engineering Group, is going to analyze the water quality of the new source, which would be the treated Lake Michigan water, and then assess the compatibility of that new water source on the existing system and develop what's called a water source transfer test plan. And that would be one for each of the alternatives, since the chemistry might be slightly different depending on the treatment selected. That water source transfer test plan is then going to be submitted to IEPA for review and comment at the end of the year. So from 2021 to 2022 would be pipe loop testing. So once the city has selected the water source alternative, that water source transfer testing plan for the selected alternative would be implemented. The time frame for that minimum would be 9 to 12 months, could be as much as 18 months or more. And that would be to verify and determine the corrosion control required to achieve no impact to those lead services. After 2022 and after determination of corrosion control, we'll go through final design and construction of the selected alternative. And then coming to 2030 is the water source switch. And prior to the switch, we'll develop a plan for that phase switch. And that could include flushing, testing, filters, various components, and that would be submitted to IEPA for approval. The selected corrosion control that was determined through the pipe loop testing would then be implemented. There would be a public information campaign and public information to prepare residents for the switch. And then there would be a phase switch of the old source to the new source in order to minimize that mixing between the two. And after the source water switch, there would then be monitoring that could include monthly and quarterly testing of not only the water quality in the distribution system, but also in lead service lines to verify, again, no impact, with the intent that there would be a contingency plan if any kind of impact was observed. So hopefully through this overview of the water source transfer plan process, you can see that while the source water transfer is a concern and major risk, the project team has developed a plan to mitigate the risk and to minimize the potential impact to the customers. So for more information on this, switching water sources, and even some more information on what happened at Flint, you can check out the educational topic that the project team put together in April of 2019. It's educational topic number 7 that's on the project website at rethinkwaterjoliet.org. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jeff Freeman.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. Great presentation so far. And now we're going to get into the questions and answers portion of the presentation. Therefore, if you have any questions, we do have some that have been provided to the panelists, and I'll go through those in a second, but feel free to add on to that as you see fit, and we'll try to take care of all of them over the remaining portion of the time that we have today. Remember that in order to, or the way that you add questions to the overall panel is to the right of your control bar. You got the Q&A portion. You just touch that. It should open up your question panel, and then you type in the questions, which are then submitted to the panelists. So all of us are able to see your questions, and again, we'll address those in a second. If you have any questions for how to go about it, actually, I guess you wouldn't be able to access it. So anyway, please put questions in there if you see fit. So here are our panelists again. Thanks again to Allison, Joe, and Teresa for your commentary. And why don't we go ahead and get started with the first question. I think that this one's probably going to be for Allison to respond to, but you guys go ahead if you want to jump in. Will the city staff recommendation on governance structure be released prior to the August 25th City Council meeting?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I can answer that question. We are not planning to publicly release the staff recommendation until it's presented to our council on August 25th. However, as I said before, we've been meeting with many of the potential regional partners. So we've been collecting that input from those potential partners, and that will all be factored into then the staff recommendation when it is presented to the council on August 25th.
All right, thank you, Allison. Next question is, will it be economically feasible for Joliet to provide high quality treated water like Chicago? Would it be more cost effective to let Chicago provide the treated water? And I suspect all three of you could respond to that, but whoever wants to take it, please do.
Jeff, I can jump in first, I guess, just in terms of comparing the cost of treated water. And that's an essential question that we're answering this year. You know, as Allison talked about in our phase 2 study last year, we did some initial very high level comparisons of the various alternatives, including the new Indiana intake alternative and the Chicago alternative. And a key outcome, key direction from the city staff going into this year was they wanted us to drill deeper into those alternatives and make sure we had try to increase our level of confidence in the estimates of both the capital costs and the operating costs. And because as you can imagine, there is a lot of responsibility that Joliet would be taking on with the construction and operation of a new water treatment plant. It's a different type of treatment process from what staff is currently using. And that does come with challenges. And so as part of the analysis we're doing this year, we're not just looking at the cost of constructing that facility, but we're looking at all the operating costs, including staffing requirements, looking at what's the type of staff that would be required to run that system, to make sure that we are getting an apples to apples comparison, that we're adequately quantifying the cost for a new treatment plant and comparing that with the cost of buying purchased water from Chicago, so that there's a good balance in that evaluation.
All right, if there's no additions to that from Allison and Teresa, we'll jump to the next question. The cost of water to Joliet residents has slowly been escalating over the past few years. What kind of timeline have you determined in terms of continued increased costs? How much, when, and how often from now to construction till construction actually begins?
I can go ahead and answer that question. So as the comment suggested, the city has approved water and sewer rate increases, and those are for 2019 through 2021. So their combined increase is about 6%, and that is an annual increase that goes into effect on November 1st of each year. So it's part of the 2020 study. We are going to be updating our rate model, and we'll be presenting that updated rate model to our council as part of this program to see some alternatives for how rate increases could be administered. There's definitely a different philosophies about whether those rates should be increased incrementally beginning now, so that the increase come 2030 is not as significant. However, those other philosophy is that the increase could occur in 2030. So the council's already added a certain amount of money into the fund to fund this program. So we are already seeing a gradual increase to accommodate the program. So I would expect that we would see those rates begin to increase over the next 10 years, but ultimately that would be a decision made by the city council.
Okay, thank you, Allison. Next question is, would Joliet transmit water to partner communities through lead or transite pipes?
So the city does not, the lead pipes are only for small diameter service lines that service, individual homes. So we do not have any lead in our distribution system, nor do we have transite. So any piping that would serve partner communities, that would be the larger transmission mains that Teresa was discussing, and those would be newly constructed. And Teresa, you can discuss more of the materials that would likely be used for that.
Yeah, so there's various materials that have been considered for the construction of those transmission mains, and that would apply to not only bringing the water from the source to Joliet, but also to partner communities. And it depends a little bit on the size. We found through the phase 2 study that the smaller diameter piping appeared to be more cost effective as ductile iron. There's also potential for steel piping, and then also for pre-stressed concrete cylinder pipe, which also known as PCCP pipe, assumed for the larger diameter pipes that seem to be more cost effective in the larger sizes. So we're keeping the options open as it gets closer to construction. There'll be a determination on material based on pipe sizes, and we'd be looking at it more at that time.
Okay, thank you, Allison and Teresa. Next question is, what is being done to the current water mains throughout the city to account for loss of water in the current and future system? I recall hearing that the current loss of water in the system is high.
So yes, so it's something the city is aware of, and as part of our receiving a Lake Michigan allocation, it's going to be very important that we reduce the water loss or non-revenue water, and that is the water that we enters the system but then is not billed. So we recognize that the city has a high rate of water loss, and so beginning in 2017, we began a 5-year plan of replacing our beginning to replace our existing distribution system. Mainly targeting areas where we have significant water main breaks to kind of take the low-hanging fruit and get those replaced so that water isn't leaking out of those pipes. So we are going to continue that program and actually increase the amount that we're replacing. Our current program, which goes through 2021, is replacing 1% of our water mains. But in order to get to less than 10% water loss as required by the Lake Michigan allocation, we have a 20-year program proposed to increase that replacement to 1.6%. That's going to be over a $15 million investment annually into our system. And so we're currently identifying those water mains that will be replaced for 2022 through 2026. There's a lot more going on besides just water main replacement. We do annual leak detection. We are also looking at all of our meters and looking to implement a new meter replacement program. So definitely water loss is something that we recognize as being extremely important that the city does need to address.
Okay, thank you, Allison. Next question is, what will happen to the existing Joliet treatment plants under each option?
So under each option, the same would happen. We would utilize our existing treatment plants, which we have 11 water treatment plants, which remove the naturally occurring radium as well as iron. Those will be, the wells will be retained, and then we'll use those as a backup. So under the situation that we're not able to, if there is, for example, a major breach of the new transmission main, then we would have that wells available as backup.
Thank you, Allison. And next question is, are the proposed rate increases given in current dollars or adjusted for future inflation?
I can jump in there, Allison, if you'd like. In the analysis that was done last year, the financial impacts of the program, we made assumptions about escalation of construction costs as well as operating costs going into the future. So the answer is that they're escalated to the future. So the rate increases that were proposed were projected for 2030 based on assumptions regarding escalation and inflation and increased costs. And we'll continue to be working with the city's rate consultant and using a financial model to try to refine those understanding of costs. So there's a mix of things being considered. Typically, engineering analyses are done in constant dollars to compare alternatives. But because of the desire of the council to understand potential impacts on rates, we have been using this financial model that includes escalation and future inflation.
All right, thank you. And then the next question is, it was noted that one advantage of the Hammond source is the ability to control rate. Have there been any discussions with the state of Indiana and Hammond to understand what, if any, taxes or fees they may impose that would impact rates and ability to control them long term?
So we began speaking with communities in Indiana during the phase 1 study. So we have been having ongoing conversations with Hammond and not only Hammond, but also other communities in northwestern Indiana to understand, the terms and conditions of using their right-of-way and lake access for the Joliet project. So we are currently in the process of negotiating those major terms and conditions, and are working towards a memorandum of understanding that would identify, what those fees could be. For any of the agreements, we're looking for them to be a, long-term agreement, and would minimize, impacts then to overall rates, to try and have those, fees identified initially. So yes, we are definitely having those discussions with those communities in Indiana.
All right, thank you, Allison. Let's see here. Oh, we've got a question over in the chat, so let's take a look at that. Because the pipeline travels through different municipalities, are various routing construction permit costs locked in place at time of agreement, or can permit costs increase after project is underway?
I can jump in on that with the routing through the municipalities. Right now, we've done major outreach to those communities outside of Illinois where the pipeline would have to go. The routing within Illinois is a little bit dependent on the governance structure that the city elects to go with, and the land acquisition ability under those governance agreements. So the intent is during the 2021 routing study to do that outreach and pin down those fees in order to have that as part of the preliminary alignment at the end of 2021. So that would be a upcoming effort in 2021.
Great, thank you. Teresa, next question. In the new system routing studies, are there plans to utilize environmental assessment resources that may be available through programs like the IDOT Local Roads Program to possibly help avoid some environmental assessment, such as hazardous waste assessment costs, since IDOT right-of-way will likely be involved?
Yeah, so we've been in contact with all of the agencies that we're looking at going through for the transmission main. So we've had project team members have done outreach to ComEd, IDOT, Tollway, Railroad, Forest Preserve, all those folks, and we're getting all the information that they have available and incorporating that into the GIS database. We're also looking at other sources for environmental information that then is also being incorporated into this GIS database. And we've gathered quite a bit of information. So yes, the information on environmental is a component of that we're using for that level 1 and level 2 routing assessment.
Teresa, I might just add on, one outcome of our prior stakeholder meeting was we received some comments from someone who was listening in about some additional potential sources of information regarding sensitive areas and environmental areas of concern. And that was very helpful. We were able to follow up with some contacts that were provided to us and pull some other information in. So as Teresa said, a key part of this is having this mechanism where we can continue to gather data as we refine the analysis and add it. So we appreciate comments and questions on that area because it helps us to make sure that we're covering all the bases.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much. On behalf of Alice, that's actually all the questions that we have that have been submitted. If you do have questions, you certainly can contact the city and we'll provide that information in a second. On behalf of Allison, Joe, Teresa, and myself and the rest of the project team, as well as the city of Joliet, thank you for participating in today's discussion. You are able to follow this overall process via social media, as well as at the website identified below. So the social media channels are listed above with Facebook and Twitter. And then the rethinkwaterjoliet.org website has a plethora of information relative to this study, past information, and then it is continuously updated. I'm guessing you have all signed up to be on the list to receive notifications. If not, you can access that on the website. So again, here's the website, and we appreciate everybody taking the time to join us today. We look forward to additional analysis for the project and for additional feedback from stakeholders such as yourself. With that, we are going to end the webinar, and we hope that everybody has a good rest of the day.